Hey everyone, welcome to this live webinar on data governance, and we're here with Bala Balabaskaran, the CTO and co-founder of Fullcast. And Bala has many years of experience managing data for sales operations teams. He's done sales planning at Salesforce, and he's kind of learned the pain of how data can really hinder your planning process. So he's going to talk us through his expertise on how to manage data and how to build a database that keeps your data clean. So a little housekeeping, we'll be taking questions throughout the webinar. So if you have anything you'd like to ask, just put it in the Q&A box. You're also welcome to use the chat feature. So we'll be answering questions as we go, and if there are any remaining at the end, we'll of course answer those. And I'll also be sending out a recording tomorrow morning, as well as a link to the slide deck. So if you want to revisit any of this information, we've got a cool few tables for you to use. You'll have access to that, and you're also welcome to share it with any colleagues. And if you have any other questions, I'll include our contact information at the end so you can get in touch with us. So hey, Bala, we're glad to have you here today, and we'll let you dive in.
Thank you, Catherine. Hello, everyone. Good morning from sunny Seattle. We are going to talk about a very interesting topic. That's something that's very close to my heart, something I've been passionate about for a long time. As Catherine mentioned, I've dealt with this problem over the course of my career for many years, primarily dealing with data in the CRM systems and especially the data governance problems that come with that. And so I've developed a sort of a thought process in my mind around how I think about the issue and how I think about putting a framework in for resolving those issues. So I wanted to share that with you today. We'll, as Catherine mentioned, we'll take questions as we go, but I have a few slides to kind of talk through a general framework for how to think about data governance, in your environments. So let's dive into it. I think the simple idea in this framework is this notion of purpose, and we'll go into detail about what that is and why that's important, and the notion of policies, and really looking at this from a return on investment lens. And that, I think, is some of the key factors in sort of building a framework around how to deal with data governance in your organizations. And hopefully we'll give you some practical tips on how to think about that, specifically in the areas that we're trying to tackle. And of course, automation is something that's near and dear to my heart in resolving this problem. It does help you think about what are those areas that are sort of primed for automation, and how can we use automation to sort of improve the general quality of the data within the databases that you're dealing with. And here today we'll primarily sort of focus in on the CRM or your Salesforce instance as an example, and we'll talk about some examples there as well in terms of how to manage data quality. So at the end of the day, if you don't get anything out of this webinar, I want you to kind of get these three ideas and use that in the way that you think about data governance in your own environment. So let's jump in. Let's start by sort of defining what data quality is. And usually it's a lot of emotion. When people don't like the data that they see, they're either unhappy with it, they're upset that they have to sit there and clean it in Excel sheets. It's not really, there's a lot of frustration associated with data quality. And so this answer, believe it or not, can be very subjective depending on who you talk to. What is the definition of data quality can be a tough thing to wrangle. And really what you have to do is think about the purpose of the data that you're collecting, storing, and managing. And I call this the fit for purpose, right? So really your bar for what is an acceptable quality of data really depends on what you're using that data for. And that's what we sort of term fit for purpose. And a lot of times, when you evaluate that, there are different dimensions that you want to think about. How is this data fit for purpose, right? And those are what we've called out here. Starting with validity, are the values in the field or in the object that you're referring to, are they acceptable for the purpose that you're going to use them for, right? That's one. And how close to the truth is it, right? Is it accurate? Is it precise enough for you for the purpose that you're planning to use it for, right? And that question really varies based on the purpose that you're using a particular field or an object for. So if you're doing financial reporting, then you want the data to be as precise and as close to the truth as possible. But if you're looking at annual revenue or IT spend of a company or an account or a prospect, then maybe it doesn't need to be that accurate, right? And so really kind of thinking about the purpose for which you're measuring accuracy is also an important sort of consideration. How complete is the data is the other aspect. Fill rates, right? And is there white space that you don't have information about? Is there missing data in the database, right? So these are kinds of things that you would consider when looking at completeness. Integrity, relationships, in the CRM, do you have appropriate relationships defined between contacts, accounts, and all the other objects within the system? How do you define dupes and duplicate accounts, and how do they affect the integrity of the data that you have? Staleness is really the volatility of the data you're looking at, right? How quickly does the data go back? And some information is less volatile, some information is more volatile. And usually some of the data that's used for planning tends to range from volatile to non-volatile. So address information, less volatile. Employee counts may be more volatile, annual revenue may be more volatile. So those are things that you have to look at for the purpose of what you're using that information for. How stale is acceptable, right? And is 6-month-old data okay? Is year-old data okay? Does it have to be exact and precise to whatever the reality is right now, which is very hard to do. But that's the dimension that you're looking at here in terms of how quickly the data goes back. The last but often forgotten idea is around compliance, right? Compliance here deals with not just regulatory compliance, but also even internal audit rules that you might have defined by your own compliance teams. And GDPR and specifically things related to your PII data or the US trade embargoes and things like that are important to consider when you're looking at data and whether you are in compliance with those requirements. So these are the dimensions that we would look at. We'll explore these further in the slide deck, but really the key idea here is when you think about data quality, you're really evaluating the quality of the data as defined by the purpose for which we are going to use it for, right? That's an important concept because I think if you lose perspective on what you're going to use that data for, then the efforts that you put into fixing data or cleaning data or buying data for addressing these different dimensions that we talked about may or may not really serve you or give you the return on investment that you're looking for. So that's an important concept to internalize and really think about the purpose. And the purpose for each object, each field varies depending on which business processes are being used, right? So we'll cover that a little bit later here as well. So the way that I think about this is that the moment you capture data and you store it, it immediately starts a journey to going back, very similar to life in general. starting from cradle to the grave in a sense, but all data goes through this journey. Some of them much more faster, some of them less so, right? And so that volatility and that staleness factor comes in really quickly, defining the lifespan of this journey. We always talk about data providers, people that sell data, and the way that I think about it is there's no such thing as a perfect data provider, right? There's data providers that are good with one type of data. There are data providers that are good in certain geographical regions, but in almost all cases, they are a little bit behind in terms of what the actual reality is. You know, you just have to accept it. You just have to understand that that's always the case. And really what you're looking for is does the staleness, inaccuracy, and incompleteness of the data that you might get from your data provider fit for your purpose, right? For what you're planning to use it for. You know, we buy contact information from data providers, but you know, we've sort of accepted that a percentage of those are going to be inaccurate. And that may be perfectly fine for the purpose that you're going to use that data for, but this is an understanding that we have with data providers. So I see a lot of people sort of think about, oh, if we just bought data from this one provider, it'll solve all my problems. Well, that doesn't usually happen, and that doesn't usually happen at scale. So it's coming to that understanding that the data you're buying is likely to be stale, inaccurate, incomplete, to varying degrees depending on the providers that you're looking at. So something to keep in mind. And not fixing bad data in your system costs you money, right? It costs you money with your sales reps calling into accounts that are not in business anymore, or calling into contacts that don't work there anymore, right? It costs money as the team deals with that. There is a lot of data cleaning that people do when they're reporting numbers and things like that. That all costs money, right? So not fixing bad data costs money. Keeping good data from going bad also costs money, right? Updating your data in the system on a continuous basis also costs money. Fixing bad data costs money as well. So you know, you're going to have to deal with cost of inaction and cost of action, right? And really what you're trying to do throughout this process is have a plan that allows you to minimize the cost and maximize the ROI. So the dollars that you're spending on data, buying data, maintaining data, and cleaning data, you really want to put that ROI lens on it to say, is this really worth the effort and the dollars that we're spending for these fields? I run across a lot of sales operations teams that just want to clean data for the sake of cleaning data, right? And that's usually a very bad idea, because you really haven't identified the purpose. You really haven't put an objective on why you are cleaning the data, and understand the ROI of that endeavor before you jump into it, right? And so I think that's an important sort of way to think about you know, how much effort or cost that you're going to put into keeping and maintaining good data in your system. It's as I said, you know, data quality as defined by fit for purpose and the cost are two things that you'd have to continuously be looking at. So this fit for purpose and this cost, you'll see that there is always a balance, right? And this is a negotiation, this is a discussion around the cost of doing something versus the quality of the data that you're expecting for the purpose you're going to use it for, right? I always have these discussions with business leaders. When we talk about this ROI element, we will say, okay, we want really accurate data on all of the employee details or the employee counts and revenue numbers of all of our prospects in a particular region. And then you turn around and say, okay, to buy it, acquire it, maintain it, it's going to cost about $30,000 a year. And then the answer usually is, well, maybe it doesn't need to be $30,000 accurate. Maybe it can be like $10,000 accurate, right? And then you change the definition of what you're looking for in terms of that fit for purpose, right? So it really kind of offers you a way to challenge all of the different dimensions that we talked about, accuracy, staleness, and all of these aspects. Cost really gives you the ability to sort of challenge what those criteria need to be, and how do you talk about it in the context of that return on investment. I've had organizations that I've worked in where we've taken out revenue generating resources. We've taken out SDRs, teams of SDRs out of selling to clean data, because the impact of not cleaning the data is that there is a 30% loss in productivity on a 800-person SDR organization, in which case, you know, the impact of that is pretty huge. So the investment that you want to put into it is really kind of driven by that ROI discussion. So think about that. This is an important sort of consideration that I think will help you make the case for data governance, data cleanliness, and if you bring that to the attention of the various stakeholders that you deal with, I think you'll have a much more productive conversation around how to think about data quality, right? Jumping on, and the other important idea here is that before you start cleaning, before you start fixing things, if you're inheriting a database, you just walked into a Salesforce instance and you're looking at the data and you say, wow, this doesn't really work. But before you start cleaning it, I always think about building the policies that are going to govern what I'm going to clean against, right? And usually there's always a lot of holes, and so you want to pick your battles. You want to pick the set of objects or fields that are really going to help progress a current business objective that you're looking at. So whether it's starting with your planning process, or you're looking at carving territories, or you're looking at expanding into a particular region, you know, tie the data work that you're going to do to support that business objective. And this is a great way for you to kind of think about the problem and also scope the problem, because you're directly sort of impacting a particular business objective. It gives you the opportunity to work across different teams within the company. Data is a company problem. It's not an individual team's problem. It's not just a sales ops problem to keep the data clean. So you have to approach this from a company perspective, and really kind of bring that perspective of looking at this from an ROI standpoint, right? Again, you know, part of defining the policies is defining the purpose. What are you going to use this data for? What's the meaning of this data? And so if you start cleaning data without knowing what you're cleaning against, or what that bar is that you're cleaning against, then you could end up spending more money and effort and time without the required ROI, right? So you could really kind of put a lot of effort in, great work, a lot of long nights cleaning data, but maybe the ROI isn't there, right? So think about that from the perspective of when you inherit a database that you're looking to clean up. Policies can be automated. So as you think about policies, I think one of the considerations is how can you automate the validation rules, the operational processes on top of cleaning data. So things like duplicate accounts. How do you put a process around cleaning duplicate accounts, especially when you have two different reps that own the two accounts that need to be merged, or the duplicate accounts that needs to be linked together. So in those kinds of situations, you know, automation really helps drive down the cost of what it takes to keep data clean. So that, you know, when you think about policies, that's one of the considerations, is really think about how do you automate that, right? And this again directly impacts your ROI conversation, because the more you automate, the less cost it is for you to deal with all of the different data quality dimensions that we've talked about. So data not being in compliance. So you define this policy, and you run the policy against the existing data that you have, and what do you do with the data that's not in compliance? And this is a complex question, because in a lot of cases there are processes or infrastructure or integrations that are impacting that data. So you may not be able to immediately fix the data, but put a plan in to fix the data by understanding the impact of fixing that data on processes. One of the very common things that I see is web to lead form that marketing has developed that's basically creating accounts and contacts within your CRM system. And so by definition, the marketing teams want to keep the number of fields that they're collecting to a bare minimum. And when you put that data into your CRM, you actually don't have a way to put it in the right territory or validate whether it needs to be, even remain in the system. So these are things that I think will require you to sort of think about all of the processes, and we'll share a framework for you to do that. But think about all the processes that are that would be impacted if you fixed a bad data, right? And you want to minimize the number of things that are there that impacts your ability to fix data. The other thing that is very common is when you have things like segmentation of your accounts driven by fields on the account, like employee count or annual revenue or state country information and things like that. So let's say you detect that there is an issue with some of those data. I want to go fix it, but you can't fix it because if you fix it, then the segmentation of the account will change, and you don't want to impact the territories middle of the year just because you're fixing data. And I see a lot of teams that are paralyzed by that and say, okay, no, we won't change anything in the CRM until the beginning of the year. And what tends to happen is that the workload for fixing the data gets pushed to the end of the year, where everything else is also going on at the same time, right? So you really want to think about policies and structures that you can put in place. One of the things that I've used effectively is something called stay in your lane, which is your segmentation, once it's defined, is not really ongoing and changing all the time based on the updates to the data that we might make. And so this allows the sales teams and the territories to be a little bit more stable, but also allow the sales operations teams to continue to work on data throughout the year as opposed to this one-time thing. So that's a example of things that you can think about when you say what happens when I fix this data, what processes are impacted by it, and what would not be in compliance if we did that. So some of the ideas, again, think about policies. Policies are a very important way of codifying what the purpose is and codifying what you're essentially working towards. And once you codify it, it also allows you to automate it, right? That's the key idea there. So what do I need to define in a policy, right? There are two key concepts here that you should think about. The first one is the minimum existence criteria. You've all heard of minimum data requirements, and that's a very common thing that's used in a lot of IT infrastructures, but a minimum existence criteria is rarely talked about. And this is something that I've sort of internalized as an important concept. And the question here is, why should this data exist in your database? And this particular database we're talking about. So, if you're looking at your CRM database, then why should this account or this contact exist in the database? And what would be the minimum criteria or the qualification that needs to be met for this contact or account or any of the data elements you're talking about to exist in this database? And the reason for asking this question is that there are a lot of scenarios where it's just easy to dump a bunch of data into the CRM. So in case you need it, you can go report on it, right? And I see people do this all the time. I see really bad practices like getting your Marketo leads to just dump all the contacts into your CRM, whether they're qualified or not, right? And what you're doing is essentially adding more work for you, right? Because every piece of data that you're adding into your CRM is things that you now have to maintain, keep, and clean out, and the work that you're going to do continues to grow. The typical number is that every business database grows at the rate of about 40% year over year. And about 20% of your data in any database, and this is research that has been done, about 20% of the data in your database is inaccurate or invalid, right? Or it doesn't meet the requirements for the purpose for which you're going to use it. So think about that. It's growing at 40%, 20% every year is just bad data. Every ops teams have to deal with that data. Your reporting has to now deal with that data. At some point, the scales will tip, and people will just give up on the data in your CRM and simply start building data sets in their in Excel spreadsheets, right? Because they don't trust the data, or it's too bad or too much to deal with. So this is really a problem when you start scaling. And thinking about sort of how much data gets added into the system, really kind of think about why this piece of data needs to exist in the database, right? You know, does a student that was interested in doing their research project on your company as a contact because they filled it out, filled out the web to lead form, do they need to exist in the system? Right, and so just kind of really think about that. Does every lead that you have within your Marketo system that's qualified and non-qualified, do they need to exist in the system? Do they need to exist in your CRM? What are you going to use that data for? Who's going to use it, right? So what you end up with is this idea of a RACI chart. For those of you that are familiar with the RACI charts, it's responsible, who's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed about these data elements. So can you build a RACI chart for the data that you have? And if you can't do it, and if you don't know who's going to use it, if you don't know who's actually going to keep it clean, then you should really think about whether that data should exist in your system or not, right? And what to do when the criteria is no longer met. So you might have a data that is in compliance with that minimum existence criteria, but at some point it's not. A great example of this is GDPR, right? So you have contacts within your CRM system for whom you have consent to communicate with them. And consent by definition in GDPR is something that expires over time. So which means when that consent expires, should that contact exist in your system? What is the process for cleaning that out, right? So think about that. And another example is trade embargoes, right? So if everybody's very familiar with the recent Huawei example, so if Huawei is an account that's in your system, or family of about 27 accounts that's in your system, once it gets added to the U.S. trade embargoes list, what are you going to do with it, right? And how do you respond to that? So all of those things kind of become aspects of this minimum existence criteria. Really think about that, because every piece of data you're adding in is data that you have to maintain, is data that's costing you money, right? So if you look at it from that ROI perspective, if you put up these gates with the right level of control, then you're going to minimize work for yourself. The other, of course, everybody's familiar with is the minimum data requirement. So this is looking at data quality as dimensions, as we talked about earlier, and saying for this piece of object and this piece of field, what are the definitions of these dimensions, right? How valid does it need to be? How accurate does it need to be? And so really thinking about that will help you define the elements of the policy, right? What are the right data fields? What is, how often do I need to update this? What do I need to do in the data to stay in compliance with the GDPR or any of the regulatory requirements, right? So those are really the aspects that you want to define for your minimum data requirements. And again, if you look at this and you look at the 500 objects that you have within Salesforce, this is not something you can do on every object in every field. So pick your battles. And when you pick those battles, again, keep that ROI lens of why you're doing it and what the return is that you're expecting to have. Tie this back into a business objective, right? Because that then gives you the support across organization to really coalesce around something that's important to the business. There are many, many, many data governance teams and projects and cross-functional task groups that are created that don't really have a business objective behind them. And it fizzles out very quickly because you lose interest and people lose interest. But if you tie it back into a key objective, like we're expanding into the international region, and that's an objective for the entire company, you get the support and you get the cross-functional collaboration that you need to actually make this work. So that's important. Pick your battles. It doesn't have to be every data field on every object. Pick the key fields that are important to you towards that business objective that you're dealing with. For instance, at Salesforce, we identified just 13 fields out of the 500 plus that we had on accounts that was important for segmentation and territory management, right? So we identify those key fields and then we define the key requirements for those key fields. And that was something that was done to support the process of making sure your segmentation and coverage and the right customer was given the right experience from the company's perspective. Right? So that's something to think about when you try to attack this problem around data quality. So let's take a look at the minimum existence criteria. We talked a little bit about this, but one of the things that I do is sort of building this RACI chart, right? And when you build the RACI chart, what I try to do is actually identify in the RACI chart the business process, not the business unit, but the business process that would actually be responsible, accountable for various aspects of the data, right? And the reason for this is you could simply say that, oh, the compliance team is responsible for making sure we are GDPR compliant. But if they don't have a process that's active, if they don't have a process that's actually working and impacting this, you would at the end of the day fail in that endeavor, right? So it's important to identify, what is an active business process that is responsible for filling the data, that's responsible for cleaning the data, that's responsible for keeping it in compliance, and so on. So as you build this RACI chart, typically we would put owners and people, but think about it as business processes as well, right? And what do you do with the data if it no longer meets the minimum existence criteria? Clean it out, purging. A lot of times we just keep dumping data into a CRM. We keep contacts who have long since moved on from the company within the system. It's not useful for marketing purposes. It's not useful for selling purposes, but the contacts are still in the system, right? Why do you keep it there? What's the point of that piece of contact? So think about it in that sense and really kind of define that aspect. Again, keeping the ROI idea in mind. So the key idea with the minimum data requirements is that every piece of data in your database is costing you money. If you keep that mindset, then I think you'll sort of make the right decisions in terms of the minimum data requirements, right? The example I like to use is you wouldn't keep stale food in your fridge, right? So if you would throw it away. And so really kind of look at this what I call hoarding tendencies with data, right? People like to keep data just in case they might need it at some point, and that just in case never shows up. But what you end up doing is spending a lot of money and effort and time keeping that piece of data that's not useful to anybody. Okay. The other common scenario that impacts your ability to sort of clean data is having more than one meaning for a piece of data, right? So what I mean by that is, for instance, accounts within the system. I see this all the time where back-end resources that are provisioned, create a one-to-one account within your CRM system, right? So that's done so that you know that there is a resource provision for that user in your software system or whatever the product is that you're selling. And this means that this reference that you've just created to account means that you can't delete duplicate accounts, right? You can't merge duplicate accounts. You can't fix it because that integration is not smart enough to deal with the fact that you could have multiple resources provisioned against a single account. So think about those kinds of automation that you would have in your system. Hold these automation to a higher standard, right? A lot of times the simplistic implementations like this that don't take into account the scale that's required in the data model can be a limiting factor in your ability to clean them, right? And really kind of look at the purpose for which that relationship exists and what's the point of that, and why is it, how is it preventing you from actually cleaning the data properly? So we've, as an example, this is a type of RACI chart that I would think about when you're looking at a particular key field or a key object. You could do this at both levels. You could do it at the object level, or you could do it at the key field level. I tend to do this at the field level, even though it's a little bit more work. But what that allows us to do is then get very specific about the efforts that we're going to put into a specific field or the data that's contained therein. So, build out a RACI chart like this, which says, okay, who's responsible for maintaining the validity requirements, who's responsible for maintaining the accuracy, etc., and who's accountable for it at the end of the day, who's part of that decision to define what accuracy means or completeness means, and what are all the teams that need to be informed of this process, right? And what this really kind of helps you build is really an understanding of all of the different business processes that would impact these different dimensions as it relates to the specific field or data set that you're looking at. It seems like a lot of work, but again, if you pick your battles and you pick the minimum set of things that you need against a business objective, building this is actually quite easy to do, right? And you wouldn't spend a lot of time doing this, but what this gives you is a framework for how to collaborate and how to work with the different organizations to impact the different dimensions related to the data set that we're talking about. And one of the things that also is important in this RACI chart is that I always advocate that the person accountable or the team accountable should own the budget for acquiring, maintaining, fixing the data, right? And this kind of changes the conversation because that then puts it in the hands of the person or the team that's accountable for maintaining data quality or different aspects of data quality, and the budget necessary for them to go do it, right? And so you get a good perspective on the ROI when you do it that way.
We actually had a question come in on that quickly. Sure. So when you're initially starting out this conversation, who makes sense to loop in?
So I think a lot of times your sales teams, your sales reps themselves, if it's a field that they're responsible for filling in, get them involved in the discussions. Your marketing teams, your finance teams, as you build this out, you will see very quickly what are all the business processes that this field is going to impact or this field is going to be used by, right? And then involve the right audience from each of those stakeholders, because the idea here is to get to a common definition of the purpose for that field, right? And so it changes by object, changes by field. Some objects are more cross-functionally used across the business, such as account and contact information is used by marketing and sales and customer support and so on. Some information like quotes, for instance, or field elements in quotes might just be used by the sales team, right? So depending on the object and field, once you start putting this on paper, you'll see all of the different teams that need to be involved, and then you can sort of engage them in that conversation.
Great, thanks for the question.
The fit for purpose. So once you get the RACI chart defined, the next step is to actually go through and define each of these dimensions. And as an example, here are the types of things that you would think about when you think about validity or accuracy or completeness. Here, as an example, what is accurate? What does accuracy mean, right? And clearly, here we're looking at the data, and is it correct? And it is correct, or is it representative of the truth? And when you're doing that, you're really looking at two things here. One is the form and content, right? And when you look at form, is the data and the values in that field unambiguous in their representation of the truth? Like, if I'm looking at the date field from a US perspective, it's December 2nd. If I'm looking at it from Canada, it'll be 12th of February. Right. So is that clear? Is the definition clear? Is the values that are in the field consistently represented? Right. Again, this is something that I see with state fields and country fields and things like that that are very critical for how you do planning. But you'll have it represented in any number of different ways. All of those values may be correct, but they're inconsistently represented, right? Which makes it really hard for you to do reporting and automation on top. So that's an example of what you would think about when you think about accuracy. The other aspect of accuracy is also how precise does the data need to be, and how much error is acceptable, right? For the purpose that you're looking at the data for. So that's something to think about when you define these elements. Completeness, dealing with fill rates, staleness, how old of a data is okay for the purpose. If you're doing biannual planning or quarterly planning, then you'd be okay with the data that's a quarter old, right? And so for that purpose, again, go back to the purpose, go back to the ROI, and keep that framework in mind. With compliance, you obviously want to get your legal teams involved. You want to get your risk management teams and your compliance teams involved to define what that means essentially for that piece of data. So these are, we'll share the deck out, but these are things that I've found very useful in sort of definitional work. And this then helps you actually think about how to clean the data. And once you have the definitions defined here, you can automate them through a number of tools or even validation rules or simple things like that within Salesforce to actually make sure that the data being collected is in line with the minimum data requirement that we're putting together here. Okay? Once you do this definitional work, once you do the RACI chart, and once you do the minimum data requirement work, then what I usually do is I build a cost model, right? And the cost model really covers these four areas. One is the cost of acquisition, right? Data records, buying records, and cleaning records require you to purchase data from different data providers, right? I've worked in organizations where we've bought data globally, we've bought data in country-specific scenarios, we've bought data for specific industry verticals, like for instance, a number of hospital beds and a number of wealth managers in the financial sector. So depending on who you're buying that data from, the data sources will be different. And there is a cost associated with it, anything from 40 cents a record to sometimes $5 a record, right? So in your mind, kind of think about what is the cost of that data acquisition? What is the cost of that data cleaning and maintenance, right? How many people do you have actually cleaning, fixing, and maintaining this data? And what is the cost that you're spending on automation of policies and things like that? So when you start to build this cost model and present it back to the stakeholders that we had talked about on the RACI chart, I find this interesting conversation that happens where the definitions start to change, right, based on the cost that you're presenting, and typically usually costs a lot more than people think it does. And so when you put that back to them, there is usually a good amount of discussion on whether the definitions are accurate, and you go back and you change the definitions and you change the cost model to relate to that. It could cost you as much as $100, and different research gives you different numbers, but about $100 a record to fixing bad data if you let it sit in your environment for too long. And there is also that the other cost of a breach, and the average cost of a data breach in the US is about $7.9 million, right? And so you're keeping all this data about consumers, you're keeping all this data about your customers, contacts, etc. And the breach of that information, we've had some very, very high profile scenarios like this happen in recent times. And the cost of that breach is quite high as well. Now, if you didn't need that data and you kept it in your database just for the fun of it, then you're also increasing your risk, right, of something like this happening. So that's the elements to think about in your ROI model. Build the ROI model. Use that as a way of having conversations about the definitions of data, who owns it, and who would own this budget that you're coming up with. And this would, I think, allow you to have a much more informed conversation with your stakeholders, rather than just approaching this as, oh, we got to clean data because data is bad. And you have no definition, you have no structure around how you're going to think about it. But I find this model very, very helpful for having those conversations and driving those discussions within your organization. So that's the gist of kind of the framework I wanted to cover today. Again, define the purpose, define the policy, define the ROI, and put it into practice. And don't do this just for the sake of doing it as a paper exercise. Thus the paper tiger. Actually put it into practice and be practical about how much of this you take on. I think the massive organization-wide data quality, master data projects, all of these things have a very high failure rate because of the factors that I had talked about. I have personally been involved in at least 3 master data projects that have failed because it was not tied to the business objectives, and the ROI of that effort was not a consideration in that discussion. So hopefully this framework will help you in your organizations to kind of think about data quality, data governance, and so on. People tend to get really worried when you use the word governance and policy, but again, keep the framework simple and help people sort of understand the financial impact of bad data, and the opportunities that result from fixing them.
Great. So we've got a few questions. I know we're right on time, but we'll just
Sure.
keep going. So we had a question. What are your tips on measuring or tracking staleness in old data?
Typically it's a factor related to the third-party data that you would buy, and what tends to happen is that we update certain fields in mass, and we do this exercise once a quarter, once a year, etc. And the ways to track sort of the staleness of the data is understanding when that data was created, when that data was put into the system, and really looking at the feedback that you get from your stakeholders that are using it for a particular purpose. For instance, if you imported contact data into your database and your sales reps come in and say, most of the data there is not usable because it's old, or the people don't work there anymore, that's the kind of feedback that you're likely to receive. And one of the things that we've done in the past is to actually allow reps or the people that are using the data to tag something as being inaccurate or stale or out of date, right? So it's just a simple field that we put on contacts and put on accounts, that we call tag for review, and essentially it's indicating that something might be stale or something. And you can use that as an objective statistics to sort of see where the impact of staleness is affecting your the people that are actually using the data. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is just think about your data providers will be able to tell you how often they update a particular field. So they'll be able to tell you, like, the employee field on accounts or the annual revenue field on accounts get updated once every 3 months or once every 6 months. So that's a good indication of the staleness of that data as well, right? So they typically publish these numbers. If they don't, just reach out to your reps and sort of ask them for that, and they can share some of that because this is the job that they do, and so they have a good understanding of what the staleness is that's involved.
Awesome. The other question that came in is, can you give us an example of some of the automations you've implemented or seen implemented and what the effect of that was on the data?
Sure. So again, validation rules are sort of no-brainer. That's something that helps you at the point of collection of the data, helps you kind of maintain the minimum data quality. The other things that I've seen are things like account hierarchy, right? So account families, which is relationships between entities of accounts, and keeping those things linked with each other. Now, this is a much harder problem, and I think we have a webinar that we did. If you don't have it, just ping Catherine and she can send you a link to it. But really relates to M&A and all sorts of activity that happen, and how do you represent that within your data set, right? Especially when you have enterprise selling teams that are selling to large accounts, that becomes a very important aspect. So we've seen automation, automation done on that front. The other side of this is also looking at duplication, dedupes, putting in fuzzy logic for dealing with being smarter and more aggressive with your dupe detection and dupe prevention, right? You'll save yourself a lot of trouble by preventing the dupe from getting in the first place. Now, and the biggest culprits for this is poorly done integrations or automation. It's very easy to go to your Marketo system and configure the integration and say, push everything into Salesforce. It's very easy to do that, and people shoot themselves in the foot by doing that without thinking about why that data needs to exist there, right? And if you turn on, dupe detection, these kinds of integrations tend to run into problems. And so what people do is they turn off the dupe detection in order to make the integration work, but inadvertently then contribute to the bad data that sits in the system, right? The other thing, like a simple example I'll tell you, is a lot of customers, there is built-in validation for country and state information within Salesforce. And you can turn that validation on, and it'll enforce country and state information to be accurate. But when you have integrations that break because they don't follow the rules as defined in that validation, people turn off the validation rules in order to allow the integrations to work, and this causes problems, right? And so, as I said, hold your integrations to a higher standard, because they should be automated to consider all of these aspects that you're defining. So hopefully that answered the question, but that account hierarchies, dedupes, industry taxonomy definitions. So what's actually the definition of a financial services account, right? And so if you look at an account like Microsoft, which industry does that fall into? Well, that's a hard decision to answer, because depending on what you're selling to them, they may be a software company, they may be a retail company, or they may be an entertainment company. So there's all sorts of sort of automation that you can do there to make that process of tagging and maintaining data in that sense as accurate as possible. But again, it all starts with your definition of policies. Once you define that, automation can easily follow.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Bala, and thanks everyone for sticking with us. Just as a reminder, you'll get a copy of this tomorrow, as well as the slide deck. And if you have specific questions on how you're managing your database, or if you want to talk more about data governance, feel free to reach out to Bala or I. Our contact information is there. The email that I've been emailing you from is accurate for me, and then Bala's is just his first name at fullcast.io, and we should include that in our email. So thanks again. I look forward to seeing you guys back online soon, and thank you, Bala, for your time today.
Welcome. Thank you, everyone.
See you guys soon.
Cheers.